Dr. Naomi Carter stood in front of her office mirror, adjusting the collar of her crisp white coat. Today was the day of the roundtable discussion on healthcare disparities, a topic she felt passionately about. Her heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety as she reviewed her notes for what seemed like the 100th time. The research she had conducted over the past year was groundbreaking, and she was eager to share her findings with a panel of esteemed medical professionals. "Okay, Naomi, you've got this," she whispered to herself, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. She glanced at the clock. Just enough time for a final review of her key points. It was crucial to present her data clearly. She knew that skepticism loomed, especially from some of her colleagues. As she gathered her materials, she thought about the obstacles she had faced in her career, often questioning her place in a field that was dominated by others. But today felt different. Today, she would make her voice heard. The conference room was filled with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Naomi entered to find an array of medical experts already seated around a large oval table. Dr. Mark Sullivan, a prominent figure in the medical community known for his condescending demeanor, sat at the head of the table, flipping through a stack of papers. As Naomi took her seat, she felt the weight of his gaze on her, a familiar sensation that made her skin prickle. "Dr. Carter," Dr. Sullivan began, his voice dripping with skepticism. "I see you've come prepared. But tell us, what exactly qualifies you to discuss these disparities? Your publication record is, how should I say this, less than impressive." A hush fell over the room. Naomi's breath hitched in her throat as she felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to evaporate in the charged atmosphere. "Perhaps if she had more experience in clinical settings, we'd have more to discuss," Dr. Sullivan continued, eliciting nods of agreement from a few other experts in the room. Naomi clenched her fists under the table, her pulse quickening with humiliation. "I have dedicated years of my life to this research," she finally managed to say, trying to maintain her composure. "My findings are based on data collected from marginalized communities, and it highlights the systemic inequities that affect patient care." "Data is only as good as the person interpreting it," Dr. Sullivan countered, his tone dismissive. "Have you considered that perhaps your perspective is biased due to your background? It's essential to approach this topic with objectivity." Naomi felt her heart sink, a mix of anger and frustration coursing through her. She had anticipated some level of skepticism, but the blatant disregard for her expertise was infuriating. "Isn't it our duty as medical professionals to confront our biases?" she challenged, her voice steadier than she felt. "The very existence of healthcare disparities stems from a lack of understanding and acknowledgement of diverse patient experiences." The tension in the room was palpable, and Naomi could sense that her colleagues were torn between the ingrained biases they held and the validity of her argument. Dr. Sullivan, however, remained unmoved, his expression a mask of condescension. As the discussion progressed, Naomi's contributions were continually brushed aside, overshadowed by Dr. Sullivan's persistent interruptions. Each dismissal felt like a blow, and she struggled to maintain her focus. The roundtable, which was meant to be a collaborative effort, had turned into an exercise in futility, leaving her feeling isolated and undervalued. Finally, the meeting came to an end, and Naomi stood to gather her things, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the humiliation she felt being sidelined by her peers. But deep down, a fire ignited within her. As she walked out of the conference room, her heart heavy with disappointment, she made a silent vow. She would not let this experience define her. She would take her research further, delve deeper into the issues she had uncovered, and prove her worth to the very community that had questioned her. With each step toward her office, Naomi's resolve strengthened. She began to brainstorm ideas for a new project, one that would shine a light on the healthcare inequities affecting marginalized communities. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was determined to turn her humiliation into a catalyst for change. Naomi Carter sat in a small conference room, the sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the scattered papers and charts on the table. Her heart raced with excitement and determination. Beside her, Aisha, her best friend and fierce ally, was busy typing furiously on her laptop. Brian, their tech-savvy intern, leaned back in his chair, studying the data they had gathered over the past few weeks. Together, they formed a formidable team, united by a singular purpose: to expose the systemic racism that plagued the healthcare system. "Okay, team," Naomi said, her voice steady as she gathered their attention. "We need to organize what we have so far. The patient testimonials are powerful, but we need to complement them with hard statistics to make our case undeniable." Aisha nodded, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "I've been going through the testimonials, and they're heartbreaking. Each story is a glimpse into the neglect and bias that so many have faced. We can't let this go unnoticed." Brian chimed in, adjusting his glasses. "I've also been working on some data visualizations. If we can create compelling graphics, it will help convey the urgency of our findings. Numbers tell a story too, and we need to tell it well." Naomi smiled, feeling a surge of hope. "Exactly. We're not just collecting data. We're creating a narrative that demands attention. We need to show how deeply rooted these issues are in our healthcare system. Let's start with the statistics on treatment disparities between Black patients and their white counterparts." As they delved into the data, the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of uncertainty to one of fierce determination. They uncovered shocking statistics. Black patients were more likely to receive inadequate pain management, their symptoms frequently dismissed as exaggerated or irrelevant. Naomi felt a mix of anger and sadness as she read the numbers aloud. "Look at this," she pointed to a chart on her laptop. "Black patients are 22% less likely to receive adequate pain relief compared to white patients. This isn't just a statistic. It's a life-or-death situation for so many people." Aisha clenched her fists, her voice rising with passion. "This is insane. We can't stand by and let this continue. We need to bring this information to the forefront. These patients deserve better. No, they demand better." Brian nodded vigorously. "Let's compile these findings into a report. We can share it with community leaders, local health organizations, and even the media. We need to create a ripple effect that forces change." Naomi felt a fire igniting within her. "Yes, let's do it. We need to make sure that every voice is heard, that every story is validated. This isn't just about data. It's about lives, real people who are suffering because of an unjust system." As they worked, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just gathering information, but building a movement. Each testimonial, each statistic was a thread weaving together a narrative of resilience and urgency. She envisioned the impact their work could have, not just in their community, but on a national scale. Meanwhile, in a polished office across town, Dr. Mark Sullivan was poring over the same data that Naomi and her team had been analyzing. Leaning back in his chair, he scoffed at the thought of her project gaining traction. "It's irrelevant," he muttered to himself, dismissing the implications of systemic racism in medicine as merely a distraction from the real issues at hand. He called a meeting with his colleagues, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've heard whispers about Dr. Carter's project," he began, raising an eyebrow. "It's nothing but a misguided attempt to stir the pot. We need to focus on real solutions, not on her sensationalist narrative." One of his colleagues, Dr. Emily Chun, shifted in her seat, a frown crossing her face. "Mark, you can't deny that there are disparities in healthcare. Ignoring them won't make them go away." Sullivan waved her off dismissively. "Unless her work can contribute to tangible solutions, it's a waste of our time. We need to keep our focus on evidence-based practices, not on personal anecdotes." As he continued to rally his colleagues to disregard Naomi's findings, a sense of determination settled over her. The more Sullivan tried to undermine her work, the more motivated she became to prove him wrong. She would not let his dismissive attitude extinguish the fire she felt for her cause. The stakes were too high, and she was ready to fight for the truth. The community health fair was buzzing with energy as Dr. Naomi Carter and her team set up their booth in the local park. Brightly colored banners flapped in the gentle breeze, and the aroma of food trucks wafted through the air, mingling with the laughter of children playing nearby. Naomi looked around, her heart swelling with pride as she observed families gathering, intrigued by the event they had organized. "Do you think anyone will come?" Aisha asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. She was busy arranging pamphlets and flyers on the table, each one detailing the systemic issues Naomi and her team had uncovered. "Of course," Naomi replied, her eyes sparkling with determination. "This is our chance to gather real stories, to show the world that these issues matter. People need to know they're not alone." Brian, the tech-savvy intern, was busy setting up a laptop to collect data through surveys. He looked up, a grin spreading across his face. "The social media post blew up last night. I think we're going to have a good turnout." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden hue over the park, local residents started to trickle in. Naomi greeted them with genuine warmth, inviting them to share their experiences with healthcare. Each story they gathered was a thread in the fabric of systemic racism that often went unnoticed. "Excuse me, Dr. Carter?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Thompson, a well-respected elder in the community. "I saw your post on Facebook. I want to share my story." Naomi smiled encouragingly, motioning for her to sit down. "Please, Mrs. Thompson, we're here to listen." As Mrs. Thompson spoke about her experiences of being dismissed by medical professionals and the pain of not being heard, a crowd began to gather. Faces filled with empathy and understanding reflected in the eyes of those listening. "This is exactly why we're doing this," Naomi thought, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The more stories they collected, the clearer the patterns became, and the more powerful their narrative grew. However, not everyone was pleased with the event. Amidst the crowd, Naomi noticed a group of local leaders, their expressions darkening as they observed the gathering. One of them, Mr. Harris, approached her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Dr. Carter, I hope you understand the repercussions of what you're doing here. This isn't just about statistics. It could affect our community's relationship with local healthcare providers." Naomi straightened her back, ready to stand her ground. "With all due respect, Mr. Harris, these stories are real. Ignoring them doesn't help anyone. We're here to advocate for better healthcare for everyone, especially those who have been marginalized." He crossed his arms, his voice low and warning. "You're stirring the pot, and some people won't take kindly to it. Be careful." Naomi felt a rush of frustration, but she held her ground. "I'm not going to stop. This is bigger than me. It's about making sure our community gets the respect and care it deserves." As the fair continued, the energy shifted. People began to share their stories openly, emboldened by Naomi's passion. They spoke of misdiagnoses, painful encounters, and the fear of seeking help due to past experiences. Each story added to the growing momentum of the movement Naomi was igniting. By the end of the day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. The event had not only gathered essential data, but had also fostered a sense of community. It was a pivotal moment, one that could not be ignored, and she was determined to carry the weight of these stories into her research. Later that night, as Naomi and her team sat together, poring over the collected data, the atmosphere was charged with hope. "We have something powerful here," Brian said, his finger tracing the statistics they had gathered. "This could change lives." Aisha nodded, her eyes wide with excitement. "Imagine if we could get this published. We could reach a wider audience and really make an impact." Naomi smiled, her heart swelling with pride for her team. "We will. This is just the beginning." With the community stories behind her and the knowledge that she was not alone in this fight, Naomi felt ready to take on the next step. She was determined to submit her research to a prestigious medical journal, knowing that the revelations contained within could be the catalyst for change in the medical community. As she looked around at her friends and allies, she felt a surge of hope. Together, they were ready to challenge the status quo and shine a light on the injustice that had long been ignored. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue through the windows of the conference center, Dr. Naomi Carter felt a surge of determination wash over her. Today was the day she would confront Dr. Mark Sullivan, the man who had belittled her at the roundtable discussion. She could feel the weight of her research pressing on her shoulders, and she knew it was time to stand her ground. Naomi spotted Dr. Sullivan across the room, surrounded by a cluster of colleagues who seemed eager to hear his latest dismissive remarks. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the anxiety that threatened to creep in. This is not just about me, she reminded herself. This is about every patient who has been ignored or marginalized. With purposeful strides, she approached the group. As she got closer, she could hear Dr. Sullivan's voice, dripping with condescension. It's a shame, really. The journal accepted her submission, but I still question the integrity of her findings. It's all very subjective. Naomi's heart raced, but she interrupted, her voice steady and clear. Subjective? Is that what you call research that highlights systemic racism in healthcare, Dr. Sullivan? The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward her. "Ah, Dr. Carter," he said, feigning surprise. "What a delightful surprise to see you here. I was just discussing the importance of rigorous scientific standards." "Rigorous standards?" Naomi shot back, her voice rising slightly. "You've made it clear that you're more interested in silencing dissent than engaging with the truth. My research is grounded in data and personal testimonies from patients who have experienced discrimination firsthand." The tension in the room thickened, and Naomi could feel the heat of scrutiny from the onlookers. She pressed on, her passion igniting her words. "The fact that you choose to undermine my work instead of addressing the issues it raises is precisely why this conversation is so crucial. We cannot ignore the experiences of those who suffer because of the color of their skin." Dr. Sullivan's expression hardened, but before he could retort, a voice from the back of the crowd piped up. "She's right, Mark. We can't continue to pretend this isn't a problem. Ignoring it won't make it go away." Naomi turned to see Dr. Lisa Chun, a fellow physician known for her advocacy work, stepping forward to support her. "I've seen the statistics too, and they're alarming. We need to listen to Naomi and others like her." The murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the gathering. Dr. Sullivan, clearly rattled, attempted to regain control. "But this is not the place for personal anecdotes. We need clean, uncontested data. Data which you've manipulated in the past," Naomi interjected, her voice resolute. "I'm not here to play your games, Dr. Sullivan. This is about real lives and real impact." As the confrontation unfolded, more faces turned to Naomi, their expressions shifting from skepticism to support. It was as if the tide had begun to turn, and she could feel the weight of validation behind her. "I've been following your research, Dr. Carter," chimed in a voice from the side. It was Dr. Samuel Torres, an internist known for his progressive views. "Your work is important. We need to advocate for those who've been silenced in our healthcare system." "Exactly," Naomi exclaimed, feeling an unexpected surge of camaraderie. "This is about more than individual accolades. It's about changing a broken system that harms so many. I refuse to let my work be diminished." The room buzzed with renewed energy as more attendees began to voice their support. The atmosphere shifted from one of doubt to a growing sense of solidarity. Naomi felt her heart swell with hope as she realized she was not alone in this fight. "Together, we can push back against these ingrained biases," Dr. Chen added, her voice ringing with conviction. "We owe it to our patients and to ourselves." Dr. Sullivan, visibly agitated, crossed his arms tightly and shot daggers at Naomi with his gaze. "This isn't over, Naomi. You'll regret stepping into this arena." Naomi met his gaze head-on, unwavering. "I won't back down, Mark. Not now, not ever." As the confrontation reached its peak, Naomi felt a sense of empowerment wash over her. She had stood up for herself and her research, and in doing so, she had ignited a fire in others. The path ahead was still fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long time, she felt that change was not just possible but imminent. As the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the conference hall, Dr. Naomi Carter stood backstage, her heart racing with anticipation. Today was the day she would present her groundbreaking research on systemic racism in healthcare to a national audience. The air was thick with tension, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. A quick glance at her team, Aisha and Brian, who were busy setting up the presentation, gave her a small boost of confidence. They had worked tirelessly, and she was determined to make their efforts count. "Naomi, are you ready?" Aisha asked, her voice a mix of excitement and concern. She straightened Naomi's blazer, a gesture of solidarity that had become a ritual before big moments. "Ready as I'll ever be," Naomi replied, forcing a smile. "Just a little nervous." "Don't be. You got this. Just remember, you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for everyone who has been silenced," Aisha encouraged, her eyes sparkling with belief. Before Naomi could respond, the conference organizer called them to the stage. "It's time," the woman said, gesturing for them to follow. Naomi took a deep breath, the air feeling heavy in her lungs. She stepped into the spotlight, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. As she approached the podium, she caught sight of Dr. Sullivan in the audience, his expression a mixture of disdain and determination. He had been plotting ways to undermine her presentation, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he had something up his sleeve. "Good morning, everyone," Naomi began, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her stomach. "Today, I'm here to share research that uncovers the deep-rooted disparities in healthcare that affect marginalized communities, particularly Black patients." As she spoke, the slides behind her illuminated the stark statistics and personal stories that her team had gathered. The audience remained quiet, but she could sense their growing interest. Just as she reached a pivotal point in her presentation, the screen flickered and went blank. A wave of panic washed over her, but she quickly regained her composure. "It seems we're having some technical difficulties," she said, trying to maintain her poise. The murmurs in the audience grew louder, and she could see Dr. Sullivan smirking from the back. Brian rushed to her side, his face flushed with urgency. "I'll fix it," he whispered, tapping furiously on his laptop. Aisha stepped forward, ready to offer her support. "While we sort this out, let me share a story," Naomi said, her voice rising above the crowd. "This is not just about numbers. It's about lives. I want to tell you about a patient named Ms. Johnson, who faced discrimination when seeking care for her chronic illness." As she narrated Ms. Johnson's experience, Naomi felt the energy in the room shift. The audience's attention was captivated by the raw emotion in her voice. Her passion ignited a fire within her, and she continued to speak, weaving in more personal accounts and statistics. Finally, the presentation flickered back to life, and she seamlessly integrated the visuals back into her speech. With each slide, she emphasized the need for systemic change, her conviction resonating through the hall. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Naomi's heart swelled with pride and relief. She had done it. She had conveyed her message despite the challenges. As she stepped down from the stage, Aisha and Brian rushed to her side, their faces beaming. "You were incredible," Aisha exclaimed, her enthusiasm infectious. "Seriously, you owned that room," Brian added, still catching his breath from the technical scramble. Naomi smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. "Thank you, both of you. I couldn't have done it without your support." However, as the applause faded, Naomi noticed Dr. Sullivan standing at the edge of the crowd, his expression darkening. She knew he would not take her success lightly. Even in the midst of triumph, she could sense the storm brewing. As the conference continued, whispers circulated about her presentation. Many were moved by her findings, while others were skeptical, including Sullivan, who was already plotting his next move. Naomi felt a mix of exhilaration and anxiety. She had taken a significant step forward, but the battle was far from over. She resolved to be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the truth was on her side and that she was not alone in this fight. The air in the conference hall buzzed with excitement and tension as Naomi Carter stepped off the stage, her heart still racing from the standing ovation she had received. The applause lingered in her ears, a stark contrast to the dismissive sneers she had faced just months ago. Her research, published in a reputable medical journal, had ignited conversations across the country about systemic racism in healthcare. Yet, as Naomi began to celebrate her victory, she felt an unsettling presence looming behind her. Dr. Mark Sullivan's scowl was unmistakable as he approached, his mouth twisted into a sardonic smile. "Congratulations, Dr. Carter," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "You've stirred quite the pot. But let's not forget that data can be manipulated." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. I hope the headlines don't overshadow the accuracy of your findings. Naomi clenched her fists, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Is that what this is about, Mark? You can't stand the idea of a black woman shaking the foundations of your little empire? Sullivan chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with malice. You think you're a beacon of truth? I've seen my share of ambitious doctors who get lost in their own narratives. You may have the spotlight now, but it can dim just as quickly. Naomi took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. I'm not going anywhere. The discussion has begun, and it's time for the truth to surface, even if you can't handle it. As he walked away, Naomi felt a surge of determination. She briefly discussed the conference with her team before retreating to her hotel room. Alone, she dove into her laptop, combing through Sullivan's past publications. Her instincts were sharp, and she needed to ensure her research stood on its own merit. But as she sifted through the data, a chilling realization began to form. Hours passed, and the dim light of her room began to fade. Naomi's eyes widened as she stumbled upon a pattern in Sullivan's previous work. An alarming number of discrepancies that suggested manipulation of data to undermine the contributions of other black physicians. Her heart raced as she pieced together the evidence. Could this be the leverage she needed to expose him? The following day, Naomi stood at the podium of a local medical board meeting, her hands steady but her heart pounding. The room was filled with colleagues and community leaders, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. She cleared her throat and began. Thank you all for gathering here today. I stand before you not just as a physician, but as a witness to the systemic injustices that persist in our field. As she presented her findings, she could see Sullivan shifting uncomfortably in his seat. In my research, I uncovered data that suggests manipulation in several publications authored by Dr. Sullivan. These discrepancies not only misrepresent facts, but also perpetuate the very biases we are trying to eradicate. Gasps echoed through the room. Sullivan's face turned crimson as he leapt to his feet, indignation radiating from him. This is slander. You have no proof. Naomi held her ground, a fire igniting within her. I have the data, Mark. I have the proof. And I will not let you undermine my work or the work of others who have faced discrimination in this field. This is about accountability. The board members exchanged glances, intrigued and concerned. The chairperson intervened. Dr. Sullivan, we take these allegations seriously. An investigation will be launched. With that, Sullivan's facade crumbled. The weight of Naomi's revelations hung heavily in the air, shifting the dynamics of the room. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation unfolded rapidly. Naomi received word that Sullivan had been suspended pending the outcome. As she walked through the hospital corridors, she felt the tide shifting. Colleagues began to approach her, expressing their support and gratitude for her bravery. She had become a symbol of change, and her research was not just a personal triumph. It was a catalyst for systemic reform. Ultimately, Naomi was awarded a prestigious grant to further her research, a validation of her efforts to shine a light on the injustices in healthcare. With newfound resources, she envisioned programs that would educate future physicians about racism in medicine and promote equitable practices. As she stood at the podium again, this time addressing a new cohort of medical students, Naomi felt a deep sense of purpose. Change is possible, she proclaimed, her voice steady and clear. But it requires courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that we can create a better system for all. The applause that followed was not just for her, but for a future where every patient would receive the care they deserved, regardless of their background.